ครับ
This is an NBC News Special Report. Here's Savannah Guthrie.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to this NBC News Special Report. We are awaiting a statement at this hour from President Obama on the situation in Ukraine 4 days after the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. As you know, 298 people perished when that plane was shot down. And just this morning, a new team of investigators arrived at the crash site. Let's go right to NBC's national correspondent, Peter Alexander, on duty at the White House for us this morning. And Peter, good morning. Do you have any preview of what the president might be saying this morning?
Savannah, it's likely the president will address both Ukraine and the situation in Israel and Gaza right now, but the focus of his remarks will certainly be on Ukraine, and he will, we are told, give an update to the American people on the situation taking place right there. It's likely the president will add his voice to that chorus of new pressure that is growing on Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia right now, with new calls taking place, including a UN Security Council resolution to be voted on later this afternoon for access and a full international investigation at the crash site. The president will likely echo the remarks of his Secretary of State, John Kerry, just yesterday, who he has now dispatched to the Middle East to focus on that region as well.
Well, let Peter stand by there. Of course, let's go to Andrea Mitchell, NBC's chief foreign affairs correspondent. We have seen the rhetoric really ratcheted up against Vladimir Putin. Andrea, what do you expect the president to say? Do you feel like they're going to try to put even more pressure on President Putin?
Well, John Kerry ratcheted up the rhetoric, and so did Samantha Power. President Obama has tried to leave some running room, so it'll be very interesting to see whether he instead does. The president's now coming out.
Yeah, he's walking out of the South Lawn from the Oval Office, expected to speak in a few minutes on the Ukraine situation. We may also hear him address the violence unfolding in the Middle East.
Good morning, everybody. I want to make a brief statement about the tragedy in Ukraine. Before I do, though, I want to note that Secretary Kerry has departed for the Middle East. As I've said many times, Israel has a right to defend itself against rocket and tunnel attacks from Hamas. And as a result of its operations, Israel has already done significant damage to Hamas's terrorist infrastructure in Gaza. I've also said, however, that we have serious concerns about the rising number of Palestinian civilian deaths and the loss of Israeli lives. And that is why it now has to be our focus and the focus of the international community to bring about a ceasefire that ends the fighting and that can stop the deaths of innocent civilians, both in Gaza and in Israel. So Secretary Kerry will meet with allies and partners. I've instructed him to push for an immediate cessation of hostilities based on a return to the November 2012 ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The work will not be easy. Obviously, there are enormous passions involved in this and some very difficult strategic issues involved. Nevertheless, I've asked John to do everything he can to help facilitate a cessation to hostilities. We don't want to see any more civilians getting killed. With respect to Ukraine, it's now been 4 days since Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over territory controlled by Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine. Over the last several days, our hearts have been absolutely broken as we've learned more about the extraordinary and beautiful lives that were lost. Men, women, and children, and infants who were killed so suddenly and so senselessly. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with their families around the world who are going through just unimaginable grief. I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of leaders around the world whose citizens were lost on this flight, and all of them remain in a state of shock, but frankly also in a state of outrage. Our immediate focus is on recovering those who were lost, investigating exactly what happened, and putting forward the facts. We have to make sure that the truth is out and that accountability exists. Now, international investigators are on the ground. They have been organized. I've sent teams. Other countries have sent teams. They are prepared, they are organized to conduct what should be the kinds of protocols and scouring and collecting of evidence that should follow any international incident like this. And what they need right now is immediate and full access to the crash site. They need to be able to conduct a prompt and full and unimpeded, as well as transparent, investigation. And recovery personnel have to do the solemn and sacred work of recovering the remains of those who were lost. Now, Ukrainian President Poroshenko has declared a demilitarized zone around the crash site. As I said before, you have international teams already in place prepared to conduct the investigation and recover the remains of those who have been lost. But unfortunately, the Russian-backed separatists who control the area continue to block the investigation. They've repeatedly prevented international investigators from gaining full access to the wreckage. As investigators approached, they fired their weapons into the air. These separatists are removing evidence from the crash site, all of which begs the question, what exactly are they trying to hide? Moreover, these Russian-backed separatists are removing bodies from the crash site, oftentimes without the care that we would normally expect from a tragedy like this. And this is an insult to those who've lost loved ones. It's the kind of behavior that has no place in the community of nations. Now, Russia has extraordinary influence over these separatists. No one denies that. Russia has urged them on. Russia has trained them. We know that Russia has armed them with military equipment and weapons, including anti-aircraft weapons. Key separatist leaders are Russian citizens. So, given its direct influence over the separatists, Russia, and President Putin in particular, has direct responsibility to compel them to cooperate with the investigation. That is the least that they can do. President Putin says that he supports a full and fair investigation. And I appreciate those words, but they have to be supported by actions. The burden now is on Russia to insist that the separatists stop tampering with the evidence, grant investigators who are already on the ground immediate, full, and unimpeded access to the crash site. The separatists and the Russian sponsors are responsible for the safety of the investigators doing their work. And along with our allies and partners, we will be working this issue at the United Nations today. More broadly, as I've said throughout this crisis, and the crisis in Ukraine generally, and I've said this directly to President Putin as well as publicly, my preference continues to be finding a diplomatic resolution within Ukraine. I believe that can still happen. That is my preference today, and it will continue to be my preference. But if Russia continues to violate Ukraine's sovereignty and to back these separatists, and these separatists become more and more dangerous and now are risks not simply to the people inside of Ukraine, but the broader international community, then Russia will only further isolate itself from the international community, and the costs for Russia's behavior will only continue to increase. Now's the time for President Putin and Russia to pivot away from the strategy that they've been taking and get serious about trying to resolve hostilities within Ukraine in a way that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and respects the right of the Ukrainian people to make their own decisions about their own lives. And time is of the essence. Our friends and allies need to be able to recover those who were lost. That's the least we can do. That's the least that decency demands. Families deserve to be able to lay their loved ones to rest with dignity. The world deserves to know exactly what happened. And the people of Ukraine deserve to determine their own future. Thanks.
President, are you considering sanctions or other actions if Russia doesn't help?
That was President Obama speaking from the White House South Lawn and clearly stating to President Putin it's time for him to step up. He made the argument that Putin has control over the separatists who are currently controlling the crash scene in eastern Ukraine and said it is time for them to step up, allow access, encourage a transparent investigation. He said, quote, that is the least that they can do. Let's go to Keir Simmons. He is in the region. He just left that train station where we understand many of the bodies have now been put into a refrigerated train. There's word this morning, Keir, that perhaps that train will be allowed to leave. What have you seen in terms of what the president just talked about, the ability of investigators to do their jobs there?
Well, Savannah, the president talked about a demilitarized zone. It doesn't feel like one, I have to say. We're just driving away from an area where we've been told there is fighting breaking out. We saw on the way there armored personnel carriers filled with pro-Russian militia armed to the teeth. And so it doesn't feel like a demilitarized zone, and that is the problem for investigators who might come here. And at the same time, in terms of the bodies, I spoke today to the leader of the forensic team who has just arrived here, and he says that they hope to move those bodies on that refrigerated train today. I asked him when they would be able to get them back to relatives. He simply didn't know, Savannah.
All right, Keir Simmons, who's in that part of the region right now. Let me turn to Andrea Mitchell if she's still with me. It seemed the purpose of this was rhetorical, really, to just kind of drive up that pressure on Russia to do something about these separatists that the U.S. and other Western allies have said he very much controls.
Well, the fact is that Putin put out a video clip for the first time today responding to the international outrage, saying that international observers should be let in. And so it was time for the president to respond. And frankly, there had been a lot of criticism over the last few days that he hadn't been muscular enough. And so this was the most forceful the president has been, challenging Putin to deliver on his promises. But again, as you point out, Savannah, it is rhetorical, because what will be the next step? Sanctions, more sanctions? The international community has yet to respond.
And of the separatists themselves, the president said, what exactly are they trying to hide? Andrea Mitchell in our Washington newsroom, thank you. Keir Simmons in the region, and Peter Alexander at the White House for us, thank you. We're going to have a lot more on MSNBC, NBCnews.com, tonight on NBC Nightly News. Some of you return to regular program. For others, there's more of today.